Hello everyone, and welcome to the Noetic podcast. I'm your host Jordan, and today, in the continuation of our series on Michel de Montaigne's essays, I'll be discussing Chapter 16 from the first volume titled Of the Punishment of Cowardice. But before we jump in, I wanted to give a little bit of background on Montaigne for our first-time listeners. Michel de Montaigne was a lawyer and a magistrate who lived during the years of the Wars of Religion in Bordeaux, France. He came from a family of merchants and magistrates and was very well educated, especially in the classics, and he published his collection of writings titled Essays in 1580, with a posthumous edition published in 1595. So with laying a little bit of groundwork, let's just dive right into the essay of the punishment of cowardice. Montaigne opens this essay with an account of a seasoned French commander who vehemently rejects the death sentence of a fellow French commander for the offense of surrendering his forces to the English King Henry VIII when both forces clashed in northern France. Indeed, one may find this position of espousing clemency perplexing. After all, this sentiment does in fact come from a captain, a man trained in the art of war, and a man who lived in a particularly bloody and war-fueled era. However, Montaigne points to a significant factor in arriving at such a conclusion: intent. Here, Montaigne delineates two sources of cowardice. The first source is weakness. Montaigne maintains that cowardice from weakness stems from the blemish that nature bestows on human beings. It follows that cowardice rooted in a moral flaw in which human beings are blameless recipients are not guilty of the charge of cowardice, according to Montaigne. Incidentally, Montaigne also writes that proponents opposing capital punishment for heretics or non-believers of Christian doctrine cite ignorance as a similar and equally blameless flaw like cowardice. Returning our attention to the second kind of cowardice, Montaigne points to a kind of malicious type of cowardice which serves a kind of a selfish end. Most injurious of all, according to Montaigne, this cowardice acts against the reason that nature grants to the human mind. Additionally, this kind of cowardice that Montaigne mentions is a moral deficiency that inherently acts against our own conscience and against the interests of the collective. Much like lying, as noted in Montaigne's earlier essay on liars, the essayist finds people who act willingly and intentionally against their conscience fully culpable for their misdeeds. Now, Montaigne shifts from the nuances of cowardice to how to punish and correct cowardice in flighty or otherwise lily-livered individuals. In Greek and Roman culture, which extolled the brash exploits of the Greek hero Achilles and revered the ferocity of the Roman consul Publius Decius Mus, or the hero Gaius Mucius Scaevola, tempered the cowardice of less brave or less reckless individuals through shaming. Montaigne recalls that Cowardice, a man known as the Solon of Italy and Sicily, instead of punishing soldiers for fleeing the battlefield with death, he instead punished them with an unusual sentence of forcing soldiers to wear women's clothing so that they may be subject to the mockery and abuse of their peers for 3 whole days in the Agora. Montaigne quotes the early Christian writer Tertullian that revealing a preference for shaming rather than corporal punishment. For in his opinion, it is better to bring the blood into a man's cheek than shed it. Ever the pragmatist, Montaigne elucidates the practical reason for the punishment of shaming in lieu of execution. It is not just pathos or pity or sympathy that can factor into commuting a death sentence. There is also the practical consideration that an individual, although branded a coward, is still useful to society. Montaigne in this essay includes the Roman response towards cowards at Cannae, indicating that pardoning cowards is necessary at times. The battle at Cannae against the Carthaginians was an absolute slaughter for the Romans, who lost anywhere from 48,000 to 70,000 men in their fighting prime, all in one day. This account highlights that the Romans did not have the luxury of executing those who fled lest they lose more able-bodied men. Although Montaigne does admit he's rather tender-hearted in prior essays, he does adeptly illustrate that there are practical reasons to avoid capital punishment. At the same time, Montaigne asserts that shaming is an effective strategy But there must be limitations to such humiliations. An excessively cruel amount of humiliation may incite a soldier to turn from a, quote, cool friend to, quote, an enemy. One particular example that comes to mind is the figure Ephialtes depicted in Frank Miller's film 300, where Ephialtes defects to the Persian side after suffering a severe degree of humiliation due to his physical disabilities. The author looks to his own time to understand the utility of debasing one's honor in order to deter flight on the battlefield or an untimely surrender. One example of a severe punishment that Montaigne relates is the anecdote of a French nobleman that handed over his military position to the Spanish. For such a transgression, the man and all of his descendants were stripped of his title and the accompanying privileges and exemptions of said title. Finally, Montaigne closes out the remainder of his essay with the final thought. Kindness towards cowards has its limits, and that an act of extreme incompetence, ignorance, and cowardice ought to be sufficient proof of malintent and should be punished as such. On the whole, Montaigne produces a fascinating inquiry into the punishment of cowardice. Montaigne delves into a complex concept of cowardice, which carries powerful legal, emotional, psychological, and philosophical connotations, as well as an inquiry into gender roles and expectations. And with that, if you liked what you heard, then check out our previous essays and check us out on YouTube, SoundCloud, and more importantly, download the Noetic app on the App Store and Google Play. And thanks for tuning in, and check in with us next week, and bye for now.